Good evening. Welcome to Covenant Presbyterian Church. I'm Ted Foote, and I'm the interim pastor here, and we're glad that we could offer this opportunity this evening. We said we were going to gather about 5:30 and start at 5:45, so we're going to honor that. And if you have one of these pieces of paper on the front, tells where we are and what we're supposed to do, and on the back is an introduction of our speaker, 3 paragraphs there, and I would just say that what is not, this is a copy and paste and a little bit of edit from Wikipedia. So you can, I suppose, believe what you want to from it. If I'd have been smart and on the ball short term, I could have added that Walter is also a Presbyterian elder. And Vicki, where you see? Okay, oh, thank you. And Walter and Vicki have for, I don't want to be fibbing here, but for somewhere between a quarter of a century and 3 decades, been involved in the leadership of a wide-ranging, open inquiry, very studious Sunday morning class at First Presbyterian Church in Bryan. So is it between 25 and 30? Is that close? Yeah, so even if I said Walter was a Presbyterian elder, people would know, well, that might not be good for but 3 years or so that wouldn't say much. But leading an open inquiry class for almost 30 years is significant. But we're not here for that tonight. We're here for Walter to bring us a presentation on the Homefront, the Texas Civil Rights Movement from 1920 to 1980. And you see down at the bottom paragraph, it said the January 14th presentation outline and the YouTube of the presentation itself will be posted on the Covenant Presbyterian Church sermon website within a day or two. So if you know someone or if you yourself want to review, you've got the information to either share it or to utilize it yourself if you are so inclined. So, Dr. Walter Buenger.
Well, it's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I hope I don't embarrass Ted, but I'm going to start with a little family story that links into the first part of the talk. And it has to do, it was my father's favorite story. When he was about 16 or 17, he went to his grandmother, would have been my great-grandmother, and said, Grandmother, I'm thinking about becoming a Lutheran minister. And she looked at him kindly, he always said, and said, go find honest work. And every time I come into a church and stand up in front, I think of that story. But I use it today because that conversation was in German. My great-grandmother was born in Texas in 1855. And in part because of memories of the Civil War, which was to her a very bitter experience, she never learned English. And she lived to be 91, never learned English, lived in Texas, born in Texas all that time. And so if we can go to the first slide, Mark, we can sort of see where this ties in. Texas was not like Mississippi. It was not a black-white binary. It always had at least 3 distinctive cultural groups. And in some cases, it had 4 or 5 or 6 in some time. And, you know, the fact that the German language persisted into the 1940s and 50s shows you that they were still a distinctive group, as were Czechs and other European groups. And so that has an impact on sort of how civil rights worked in Texas. It wasn't just one group or 2 groups. It wasn't Mississippi, and that's important to keep in mind. Also, Texas was increasingly urban. And you can see here from this total that just how split the population and demographics were. And this is, I want to give a shout out to Terry Jordan, a cultural geographer, who first got me on this sort of split of these numbers. You see the persistence of these groups over time, and you can see the sort of flip between 1887 and 1980 between African Americans and ethnic Mexicans or Tejanos. And so those are both groups, right, that have significant civil rights movements. So that's the sort of second concept, and you can see the urban numbers down in the bottom. And the final point, and maybe we can show you this image to sort of illustrate it, is that what happens on the local area shapes the national and international. With civil rights, we often think of, Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King, and so on. But we ought to think of what happens here in Sherman, or in Grayson County, or in Dallas, or in Houston, as influencing the national and the international. This is an illustration of the lynching of George Hughes in Sherman in May of 1930, and it's in a French newspaper. So what happened in Sherman made international news and shaped attitudes about civil rights. So those are three sort of organizing concepts, three ways of thinking about Texas that'll help you sort of understand why civil rights played out like it did. Texas was multicultural, three or more distinctive groups forever. Texas was urban, and what happened in places like Sherman or Dallas or Houston or San Antonio shaped the national and international scene. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let me sort of go over what those numbers might mean. And if you have questions, jump in. We're small enough that we can handle questions here. So those numbers, as I said, mean, right? The fact that my great-great-grandmother still spoke German in 1932 or when she died in 1945 meant cultural diversity. It meant that when Lyndon Johnson went to Washington, D.C., he didn't go from a place like James Eastland, the senator from Mississippi and a friend of his, went to Washington, D.C. He went from a place that was more diverse. He went from a place that was influenced by more groups, European ethnic groups, ethnic Mexicans, African Americans, and that, I would argue, sort of makes Texas a tad less violent, a tad less willing to able to change, a tad more willing to change, and a tad different. Not that Texas was the greatest place in the world to be an African American or ethnic Mexican, but it was a little bit better. And that helps you explain Lyndon Johnson. How could Lyndon Johnson, a Southerner, understood politics, said that what he did on civil rights would turn the South against the Democratic Party for decades? How could he do that? And I think in part, let's give him credit for being a unique individual, but in part it's because he came from a culturally distinct place. And I'll get back to this in a minute. But what I'll say about the cultural borders is that borders connect and borders divide. So the fact that Germans vote with African Americans until the 1920s and 30s meant that they connected with African Americans in the civil rights movement in the early days. But perhaps as they grew away from their Germanness and towards Anglo attitudes, they moved into a different party and a different perception of civil rights. And so borders connect, borders divide. And one of the ways they connect and divide is what I call aspirational racism. Oh, thank you, Ted. I hope I don't choke on the up here for you. But aspirational racism is a concept I've been working on the last couple of years. And what started me thinking of it was I was doing a book about a German newspaper editor who continued publishing in German until 1936. And I discovered that he and the majority of Germans voted for the poll tax amendment in 1902. And he explained it in part because he wanted to be the better sort to vote. And this, I would say, has to do with attitudes about whiteness, which I'll delve into a little here. I don't want to bore you too much by a topic that historians dig into. But if whiteness is not just skin color, whiteness is a perception that somehow you are better than. There was a saying when I was a boy, and Light, you may have heard this, or Ted, you may have heard this, a saying, "That's mighty white of you." Did any of you ever hear this saying? That didn't mean skin color. That meant that's good, that's nice, that's dignified, that's high class. And that's what aspirational racism is, to be perceived as good, high class, better than. And I believe, although I can't prove it conclusively, that explains why Texas Germans, who naturally had an alliance with African Americans and ethnic Mexicans in opposing prohibition and other issues that targeted ethnic groups, why they drifted towards becoming white. To tell you another family story, my grandfather, when I left, used to tell me, "Don't come back a lazy American," by which he meant Anglo. Don't come back a lazy American. And so as late as, he was born in 1880 or thereabouts, as late as into the 1960s, he had a perception of Germans different from Anglos. But he had moved from his mother in that he spoke primarily English. He told me that story typically in English. If he really wanted me to remember something, he'd repeat it in German, which I didn't understand very well, but he'd, hammer it home. Work makes life sweet, or whatever little thing he wanted me to remember. And so he drifted. And he drifted, I think, in part, as others did, as perhaps ethnic Mexicans did, as perhaps Tejanos have and done, perhaps as some African Americans have done, because they aspire to being white in the sense of being high class. I'd also say those numbers mean that you have to think of at least two different civil rights movements in Texas, concurrent civil rights movement. And you also have to think, I would say, in why urban Texas powers the civil rights movement. They were safe in cities. They were wealthier in cities. They had legal talent available to them. There was a good reason that William Durham moved from Sherman to Dallas. There was more money to be made, more power to be wielded, more associations to harness. to achieve his goal of civil rights. Civil rights happens in Texas as Texas becomes more urban. When it starts out as barely urban at all, as Mississippi still is not 50% urban. You were telling me about Jackson. It's all there is in Mississippi in terms of urban areas. Texas has San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, El Paso, right? All of these urban centers power not only an African American civil rights movement, but an ethnic Mexican civil rights movement. And I can't say enough, and this is a good entryway into Bill Durham, that it's bottom up. It's from Dallas, it's from Sherman, it's from San Antonio, not from Washington, D.C. down. That's how civil rights works. And that should be encouraging to all of you. You can do something here in Sherman or wherever that might make a difference. So, Mark, let's go to the next one. William Durham, who many of you might know of, was a World War I veteran, and he set up a legal practice in Sherman. It's interesting to me that he studied law. Back then, you didn't always go to law school. He studied law with a white attorney here in Sherman. And that tells you something of great interest. I wish I knew more about that particular story. He was here in 1930 with the lynching of George Hughes. And I won't go over that story, but if you want the story, you can go to the Handbook of Texas there and read about the story and lynching. But William Durham, as I said a minute ago, moved to Dallas, became a prominent attorney in Dallas. He was lucky enough to have a good client in an insurance company in the North Texas area, and he was relatively affluent and able to afford civil rights cases. And after his move to Dallas, backed by the Dallas NAACP and the Houston NAACP, he took repeated cases, increasingly involved in civil rights. One of the premier cases was the case Sweat versus Painter, which is the next slide. He was one of the lead attorneys along with Thurgood Marshall. This is a great example of a bottom-up approach to civil rights, bottom-up understanding of civil rights. This was a case that was financially backed by the Houston and Dallas NAACP, who recruited Heman, Mary, and Sweat to bring this case against the University of Texas under the legal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, in use since the 1890s. You could have separate facilities as long as they were equal. There was no law school for African Americans in the state of Texas. And William Durham recognized this, built the case around this, brought the case, kicked it up all the way through. Sweat applied to UT and was turned down because he was black. And then by 1950, won the case on the Supreme Court. This was a case that was a precursor to Brown versus Board of Education, a slightly later case. And it's important because it's the first time that you can sort of see the cracks in civil rights, in segregation in Texas. You can first see, the story goes at the University of Texas that they put Heman, Mary, and Sweat out in the hall. He had a chair out in the hall. And he didn't finish, he didn't graduate. He, not surprisingly, found it a hostile environment. But it's the first crack, and it's because of people like Bill Durham. It's because of the Houston NAACP, and the Dallas NAACP. It's not because of somebody up at the top deciding that this case ought to be settled. And that, again, as I said, that's important. And Brown versus Board of Education has similar roots. Bottom up. Civil rights is bottom up as much or more than it's top down. Okay, let's go to the next one. I'm most interested in voting. I've voted all my life. Even before I was eligible to vote, my father was in politics, and I helped campaign, so I'm a voting junkie. And so I follow voting cases clearly, and am disturbed whenever it happens that the vote gets restricted. And so one of these days, maybe I'll write a book about the poll tax amendment of Texas in 1902. You know, we think of progress. We think every year that goes by is progress, that every year is better. I'm not so sure. The 19th century Texans resisted every attempt to limit voting for men. They didn't, of course, allow women to vote until 20 years later than the poll tax amendment, but for men. Those German and those Czech immigrants and those ethnic Mexican immigrants, they could all vote. No citizenship requirement. No citizenship requirement to vote in Texas until about 1920. And so if you declared that you were going to be a citizen in the sweet by and by, and you were male and over 21, you vote, and had been in Texas 6 months, you voted. And so in a way, the poll tax amendment, it rolls back for men, this provision. So why does it happen? I'm not sure. Perhaps one of these days I'll do enough research to figure it out. But I do think it does have to do with this concept I introduced a minute or two ago about aspirational racism, about elevating the better sort to the top. And it happens, and it also has to do with the Democratic Party wanting to secure its dominance, as voting rights laws often do. They are designed often to give one party or the other an advantage. And the poll tax clearly gave the Democratic Party an advantage over the Populist Party that came in Texas right before then, or the Republican Party, the black and tan Republican Party that had black as well as white members. And so maybe it's politics, maybe it's aspirational racism, maybe it's something else that I'll discover down the road. But it happens at the same time as the evolution of the all-white Democratic primary. And from early in the 20th century until 1944, when you went in to vote in the Democratic primary, you would sign something typically that said, "I am white and I pledge to vote for the nominee of the Democratic Party." And this case was also challenged by a Houston African-American man, Lonnie Smith, who took it all the way to the Supreme Court, 1944, won, and from that point, African Americans could vote. Ethnic Mexicans had a strange sort of quasi-white position. In some counties in Texas, they were allowed to vote, and some they were not, depending on the local registrar or the local Democratic Party. I often get asked, well, why did they even care about voting in the Democratic primary? Why didn't they just vote in the Republican Party? Well, one, Republicans won fewer and fewer general elections as the 20th century wore on. And two, the Republicans pushed them out in the so-called Lily White movement of the teens and 20s. And I'd argue that that people understood the vote meant something. My favorite example of the vote meaning something from 20th century Texas is a guy some of you may have heard of if you've driven on the highways in San Antonio, and that's a congressman named Harry Worsbach. You know the street that goes around San Antonio. This was a real person, the only Republican congressman in Texas, congressman throughout the 1920s. And he won by the backing of this black and tan Republican faction. German Texans, obviously by his name he was German, African Americans, ethnic Mexicans. And he won repeatedly, and he was the only Texas congressman to support the dire anti-lynching law. For years and years in Congress, the majority in the House voted for an anti-lynching law shot down in the Senate by a filibuster. No Texas senator, no Texas congressman, except Harry Worsbach, who depended on this coalition of ethnic Mexican, African American, and German Republicans to win election after election. No Texas congressman ever voted for an anti-lynching law. And if there's a civil rights law that means anything, certainly that's it. A law that might help avoid incidents like happened here in Sherman in 1930 to George Hughes. Now, he was a good person, perhaps he did it out of the goodness of his heart, but he did it also because it won him votes. It got his supporters to the polls. It helped him get reelected. And he would have been reelected if he died in office. And so if you remember that road and that man, it'll tell you why voting mattered. Because politicians respond to the interests of their voters. It was in the interest of Harry Worsbach's voters to do something about lynching. It was not in the interest of any other Texas congressman with an all-white Democratic primary to do anything about lynching. In fact, they could grandstand about states' rights or defending the white society in their area and get votes. So the vote means something. And you only have to look again, jump forward 20 years from 1944 and look at the Voting Rights Act and look at who it brought into office, people like Barbara Jordan. There had been no African Americans hold statewide or national office in Texas from early in the 20th century until the mid-1960s, until the class that came through along with Barbara Jordan in the mid-1960s. That's not accidental. That's a result of things like the poll tax, the white primary, and so on. The poll tax amendment is ruled unconstitutional on a national level, and later it's extended on into state elections. Voting matters. Many of the changes that you see today trace back to laws. I used to hear you can change the law, but you can't change people's hearts. Well, maybe not, but when you know that you're going to lose elections if you don't change your heart a little bit, maybe it does change your heart, at least on the surface. So voting matters. So, Mark, if we can go to the next one. I want to touch base again on this concurrent movement and go back in time a little bit and look at another local personality to show you, again, this bottom-up approach. And this is another one of my favorite Texas politicians, a guy named Jose Tomas Canales, who comes from a long line of prominent landowners in the Brownsville area. And he happened to be on and off in the state legislature throughout the first 20 years of the 20th century. And in the World War I era, in the mid-teens, there were a series of lynchings of ethnic Mexicans and murders of ethnic Mexicans by the Texas Rangers and other police officers. And J.T. Canales brought this to the attention, a member of the House, Texas State House, brought this to the attention, had a special hearing, was threatened over and over by Frank Hammer and other Texas Rangers. I think Frank Hammer was also here in the George Hughes lynching and stood by while it happened. But he was involved in the J.T. Canales sort of attacking J.T. and threatening him. He went on, he retired from the legislature, never ran for public office again, but he did help found the League of United Latin American Citizens. And I want to stress that last word, citizens. He argued that you should consider ethnic Mexicans as equal citizens. He argued for learning English, fitting in, and so on. And LULAC became, like the NAACP, a way to harness support for civil rights, as did the GI Farm, founded by Hector P. Garcia in 1948. And together, they brought a case that wound up in the Supreme Court too, Hernandez v. Texas, that had to do with jury formations. Routinely, in much of Texas, if you were an ethnic Mexican, you were excluded from the jury pool, even if the case involved ethnic Mexicans. You couldn't have a jury of your peers because you were an ethnic Mexican. African Americans, same thing, but this case ruled that you had to have a jury of your peers, that ethnic Mexicans were white, but perhaps not white in the same way, and so that Anglos could not serve as peers in a jury trial of an ethnic Mexican. Whiteness and the Tejano experience are a strange case. I showed you those 1930 census numbers up top. The 1930 census was the only U.S. census that broke out Mexican from other groups, and that was protested by many leading authorities, leading figures in the Tejano community who wanted to be regarded as white. They wanted to be thought of as white. I keep coming back in my own thinking, in my own research, in my own mind, to what does whiteness have to do with it? Wanting to be regarded as good, high class, high tone. But yet, in this case, Hernandez v. Texas, obviously, pragmatically, other white people, white Anglos, could not be peers in the sense they couldn't give you a fair trial. White, but not equal. And so I remind you that whiteness is more than skin color. as was recognized later by various youth movements. The Chicano movement, for example, of the 1960s and 70s. African American movements of the 1960s and 70s. You had to be proud of who you were, not white. As long as you aspired to be white, you were trapped. You were trapped. And so this case is interesting in the evolution of attitudes in the Tejano community, which are still, you still see, about white and not white, Chicano, acceptable, and so on. It's a fascinating legal case, and I would encourage study on this case. Let me go to another interesting person, Henry B. Gonzalez. Of all the places in Texas in which you see the most overlap between ethnic Mexicans and African Americans, it's San Antonio. Maybe it has to do with the particular uniqueness of San Antonio. But Henry B. Gonzalez not only was an advocate for Tejano civil rights, but when he was in the state legislature in the 1950s in Texas, he consistently opposed the efforts of Anglos in the legislature to hold up Brown versus Board of Education by any way they could, to maintain segregation as long as possible. Segregation of African Americans as well as ethnic Mexicans. So something about San Antonio, again, I suspect it's the practicality as much as everything. African Americans had a long history of voting in fairly large numbers in San Antonio. To win elections, you needed their vote. And so you needed to deliver something to that community. Just as Harry Warsbach delivered, Henry Gonzalez delivered. Voting matters. But I would encourage you, as you think about civil rights, to think about him as well. A long career after that in the U.S. Congress as a Democrat. Okay, Mark, let's go to the next one. Education. This is a big one that people think about when they think about civil rights. Not many people understand, at least judging from my students. Y'all are an older crowd for the most part, so maybe you understand. Texas had 3 schools through much of the early 20th century. It had a white school, it had an African American school, and it had an ethnic Mexican school. And so communities would have a 3-part school system. Think of how expensive that was. 3 school buildings, 3 sets of administrators, 3 sets of this, 3 sets of that. Very slow actual integration after Brown versus Board of Education. Very slow integration before then. There was some movement in World War II. The American GI Forum took a lead again. Delgado versus the Bastrop Independent School District sort of broke ground for at least ethnic Mexicans. And so by the end of the 50s, African Americans had begun to move into white schools. But for, Tejanos had begun to move. But for African Americans, there are places in Texas as late as 1971 or 1972 or 1973 in which there was no effective integration. And when they did integrate, oftentimes they would put all of the African American students and the ethnic Mexican students in the school, and Anglo students would go maybe to private schools or something else. That was integration. So Mark, let's go to the next one. see the end of this. I mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. I mentioned Sweat versus Painter. I love sports. I played basketball, at noontime in Texas A&M when I wasn't playing tennis with those guys you mentioned, till my knees wore out. And so I followed the sports, and I've marveled at how long it took to integrate sports in Texas. 1969, the last all-white national championship football team. 1969, University of Texas. That's a long time after Sweat versus Painter, and a long time after Brown versus Board of Education. But 1966, if those of you who remember, and if you get this, I encourage you to look at clips from the game between Texas Western and the University of Kentucky. If you're NBA fans, you'll recognize a very young Pat Riley, the general manager of the several NBA teams and a player himself in the NBA. You'll recognize Pat Riley as a player on Kentucky. An all-black Texas Western team beat heavily favored all-white University of Kentucky team in 1966 in a place that was more ethnically and culturally diverse. This is back to sort of borders connect, borders divide. Right? There's obviously a border in a place like San Antonio between African Americans and ethnic Mexicans and Anglos, school systems and so on. But it's more possible in El Paso and perhaps San Antonio, in places that have more equal balance between the groups, for a team like Texas Western, all black, to be tolerated and to win. So I would encourage you, if you get these, sort of go look at young Pat Riley and see that he is beaten by an all-black team. Let's go to the last bit here, and then we'll have time for questions. Lyndon Johnson will never recover from the Vietnam War in historians' eyes or in historians' minds. But I think he needs a fair shake and a second look and a deep examination of why he did it in his support for civil rights. Now, he was a politician just like Harry Warsbach or Henry B. Gonzalez, and he knew perhaps that in a place like Chicago, if he was going to win big in the next election, he needed a big turnout of African American voters. He understood that completely. But he also understood the opposite, that he would lose votes in a place like Texas or Mississippi. So why'd he do it? He gave a fascinating speech, and there's clips there that you can look at, in March of 1965, in which he called "We Shall Overcome," piggybacking on that phrase used in African American civil rights. And he traces back why he first began to think about civil rights to his time teaching in a small ethnic Mexican community in Cotulla, Texas, where he saw what it was like to have limited opportunities and limited hope. And he wanted to give everyone more opportunity and more hope in pursuit of, as he put it, of the American dream. So yes, hold Vietnam against Lyndon Johnson all you want. I'm with you. I anxiously waited to see what my draft number would be, and so I was there. But give him some credit for moving beyond the politically easy, moving beyond his raising, open to what he saw in places like Cthulhu. And give some credit to Texas, where it's not one group, it's not two groups, it's three groups interacting, and in some cases, 4 groups, if you go back to Harry Worsbach in the 1920s, interacting. So compare him to James Eastland in Mississippi, for example. Never supported integration on any level. Different place, different background, different cultures interacting in Mississippi, a black-white binary. So, Mark, let's go to the last one, then we'll stop for questions. Ted asked me why I stopped in 1980. Well, I had to stop somewhere. Y'all are getting tired and getting hungry and ready to move on. But I often stop. I'm teaching a course, my last course in university teaching this semester, in which I compare civil rights in Mississippi and Texas. And I stop it in 1980. And so I thought I'd stop this in 1980. But I always wind up this thinking like an historian class by showing them a little clip of Ronald Reagan's speech in Neshoba County, Mississippi in August 1980. Anybody know the history of Neshoba County? That was where the 3 murders of the 3 civil rights workers happened in the early 1960s. And he gave this speech in which he talked about states' rights. And those of us of a certain age sort of recognize in civil rights, especially historians, recognize in states' rights this sort of claim that it was states' rights, not slavery, that caused the Civil War, something thoroughly debunked, and Nikki Haley should have known better. But he mentions it over and over in Neshoba County. And so it gets me back to thinking about this term, which I guess lied I'd best develop into some sort of article or book or something one of these days, that you want to be perceived as the better sort. You want to move up. But it also gets me thinking of, he didn't give that speech in Texas. He gave that speech in Mississippi, a place that, unlike Texas, was not urban. It was not a place that had enough diversity where that would have hurt him and not helped him. Politicians are rational. You've got to assume they're rational. They're saying and doing things because they think they're going to get votes by it. He said it in Mississippi because Mississippi didn't have different cultural groups. So I always wind up this course, and I wind up tonight by saying, into the future. I like to think about what persists from the past, as well as what changes. And we often assume that change is the nature of history. But we perhaps should also assume that persistence is the nature of history. That something about such concepts as aspirational racism persist. And so I ask you, when you think about moving from Lyndon Johnson to Ronald Reagan in Texas, when you think about moving from Henry B. Gonzalez to some modern political figure, I ask you, what has happened? What is the change? What is the vote? What are the voting laws? What do they mean? What have we done? And what does that say about persistence and change? Thank you. Hope you got something. I'll answer a few questions if you got any.
Excuse me, on the questions, we have a choice. I can bring you the microphone because we're trying to record, or Walter can paraphrase your question before he gives a response. Is that all right?
Yes, ma'am.
So I grew up in a little South Texas rural town called Mathis, close to Corpus Christi.
Yes.
And we had railroad tracks that divided the whites from the Hispanics. We didn't have any blacks in
We
the
had
town of
very much the same thing in Fort Stockton where I grew up.
Yes. And in fact, just down the street from my home with my parents, the migrants, workers lived, and they lived without plumbing or electricity. That was just a part of what the town was. And the Hispanics had the wooden building, all white teachers, all white administrators, and the whites had all the brick buildings. And one day in the 50s, a black family moved to town. And the school board had to meet to decide which school they would go to.
That's a wonderful story.
They put them in the white school.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. And how long did that two-part school system last, you know?
Well, when civil rights sort of became the thing, the wooden school building, you know, began to fall down and so forth, and so rather than just replacing it, they moved them. But it
Probably
was,
the late 50s.
yes, but it was very hard for the Hispanics to be in the school with the white children because they were severely punished if they ever spoke a word of Spanish
Yes,
in school.
yes.
And and all of a sudden we start having a nurse or somebody come in our room and have us all put our hands on the desk and go through our hair with a stick to see if we had head lice after the schools were integrated.
Yeah. That's
was
interesting. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I don't have a question necessarily, but I feel compelled to relate a family history of the Sherman situation. My parents, on my father's side, my grandfather was from Kentucky and had come to Texas, and he was the farm manager for the Woodman Circle home as it was built from the ground up and all. And so there were 6 children eventually in the family, but when my father, who was the eldest, was about 5, and the brother Jack was a little younger, and then the little daughter, 3 out of eventually 6, they all came to town because they lived on the property outside of town and in the car, and to do shopping on Saturdays. And so my grandmother with the 3 kids was in one part of the town, and then my grandfather was going to do the men thing, you know. and my father, who was the eldest, and he was about 6, has told the story as he recalled it. He said his dad came back and gathered them up and said, "We have to go home. And there is something bad happening here." And he said, and I don't know what, but my father, even as a child, knew it was terrible. But it was the day that they lynched
George Hughes.
George Hughes. And so my grandfather took them all the way out west to where the Woodman Circle home, they had a big 2-story home on that property that was for them. And then he came back to downtown, my grandfather did.
Mm.
And as my father told us the story as young adults, my brother and I don't think we ever asked a word about what my grandfather did, but he was there. He was at the square when all that happened. So for our family, you know, for us, it's just this
Just like it happened yesterday.
It is, and you never the adults never talked about it. I mean, as of course we didn't know. My brother and I didn't know about it for many years, but my brother also was an Austin College graduate, and we learned about all this. I mean, it has been a part of our lives, and I look at it now and I realize, well, yes, it would be, because all of the children of this family knew this story. And then it was that we don't talk about it. But as my brother and I got to an age and living in the 60s and 70s, then we wanted to talk about it, and then that was another brouhaha, you know, so you don't talk about it. So
Yeah.
it's impacted my life, I will say. In a way I
History
can't exactly
is
explain.
often about erasing the past. That is something I've fought my entire career, erasing things like the George Hughes lynching or the railroad tracks dividing the towns or the brutality of many things.
I guess I have the next question. Since we're here in a beautiful church sanctuary, I'm moved to ask about the role of religious belief and religious denominations in all of the mixes that you've described. And one might suppose that Roman Catholicism, Methodism, Presbyterianism, down through the more Bible-based religious denominations of which these groups belong respectively, had different views of social flexibility and interaction. How would you suppose that enters into the mix you're talking about?
So I would say that religious affiliation is very much a part of why you cling to a particular cultural group. So in the case of the Germans, it's not only that they're German, it's they're Lutheran. In the case of Anglos, it's not only that they're Anglo, but they're Baptist. And African Americans, a separate Baptist. And I would also say that this is part of having taught this Sunday school class for 25 or 30 years. I think of religion as being held in a pot that is the larger culture. There may be something true and good and of great value in the religion itself, but it is within the container of the culture. And so you would see, for example, in the 1920s, an almost one-to-one correlation between being Baptist and being in the Ku Klux Klan. It's culture as well as, social justice, or all are created equal before God or something like that. It's both. So there's two parts answer. Religious affiliation keeps the cultures different, and also the culture itself influences religion.
And I guess over time that can change.
That we hope. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm curious to know if you think that areas of Texas that are not multicultural, but instead bicultural, have any effect on what you've talked about. And I'll give you my example. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley on a cotton farm on the banks of the Rio Grande.
Mm-hmm.
There were only 2 cultures there. There
Right.
wasn't a third of any kind.
Right.
I don't recall any blacks in school. I don't recall any Germans or anything else.
Right.
Very different as only 2 cultures.
And you could go also to a place like Texarkana where you'd see Black and Anglo almost exclusively. Yes. So Texas is, yes, that's a good point. Texas is a very diverse place. What I like to say is that Texas is a place of island communities. And so there's an island in which it's primarily, as you described, South Texas. There's an island, as I would describe, the Texarkana area, black and white. But they all have to intersect in the state legislature and state law and state government and business interests. So they are island communities, but they're in the same ocean. They're in Texas, if you understand what I mean.
You're saying the drop gets lost in the bucket.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, they're in the same ocean. No, in the island, they're distinctive and different. And so in South Texas, J.T. Canales didn't run for office again after 1920. But now, people like J.T. Canales control politics.
As a sidelight of that, I'm wondering what my mother thought of herself as. Was she a cultural Mexican? I don't think she would have understood that.
No, I don't think she would have.
But I find it interesting, your use of that term
Yeah,
to describe it was probably my mother.
yeah.
But she wouldn't have described herself that way.
No, oftentimes they didn't. Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know your mother. Never knew your mother. But oftentimes it's because this strange way of wanting to be perceived in a certain way. You want others to perceive you in a certain way. It's a strange sort of dynamic that goes on in the minds of people like your mother.
If I had to guess, my mother thought of herself as Mexican.
Not Texan.
But
Yeah.
I will say, when we married in 1975, we were living in Beaumont, and his mom and his sister came to Beaumont for the wedding and asked me if I would make an appointment for them to have their hair done. And she said to me in confidence, I have it on Do Not Disturb, I'm so sorry.
Don't worry about it.
She said to me in confidence, do you think they will be nice to us because we're Mexican? Or not nice to us because we're
Yeah.
Mexican? That was in 1975.
Wow. Are you familiar with the Felix Longoria episode? Felix Longoria was ethnic Mexican, of Mexican descent, and he was killed in the service of the U.S. Army in the Pacific. And his remains were not recovered for many years. And then they were recovered late 1940s, early 1950s. I can't remember the exact date. I think the place was Three Falls or something like that, and or Three Rivers, perhaps. And the local funeral home owned by Anglos refused to have the service or to bury him. And so GI Forum intervened with Lyndon Johnson and got Felix Longoria buried in the National Cemetery at Arlington. Just shows you another side of Lyndon Johnson. So
One more question, if there is one.
here's somebody, Ted.
Hello. So
Hi.
hi. There you go. So I'm an Austin College student,
Oh, wonderful.
and my parents are migrants, so I'm a first generation here.
Great.
So I had my whole education in Texas, but I have learned more about civil rights court cases of like Latin American from you than I did throughout my whole childhood, which is kind of upsetting to me because in a way, like I took like Texas history, I took world history, I took a lot of courses relating to a bunch of like civil rights movements, but every time it got to us, it will always be like one chapter where obviously it'll be like, oh, and then like the Aztecs or the Mayans, they got killed off by the Europeans, and the end. Now we're moving on. And first of all, I would like to thank you for your
Wow.
lecture. It was very informative. And also, I just want to say, even though segregation's over, it doesn't erase the fact of who controls the narrative of history and who's teaching it. Because throughout my whole childhood, I felt like we were erased. We weren't given a second thought. And it's not only me, but it's also the Asian Americans and sometimes even the African Americans. And I still feel, even though we're not physically separated, we are mentally. We are mentally put aside in the history lessons, in wherever, like in schools, like in cultural clubs. We still have that mindset of others.
Well, thank you. I strongly believe that every group deserves the dignity of having their history told, whether it's a shocking history, a tragic history, as long as it's honestly told and accurately told, it needs to be told. And so I'm glad that you were here tonight. Thank you. So.
You can share YouTube on other channels. And you should share the YouTube with your friends.
So everybody has a history, and everybody's history ought to be recorded and remembered, not erased, as many in Texas still want to do, to erase history, to erase the cause of the Civil War, which is, something I've fought my entire career. My first book was about secession. I know what caused the Civil War. So,
Walter, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And y'all, I was standing over here. It is against the window, but I'm sensing that our 2-hour or 3-hour warm-up on the sanctuary is probably, nobody's going to get icicles, but the heat's probably turned off now. So mix in here, mix out there, and thank you very much for being here this evening.
Thank you.